Wednesday for parts of Wales and southwest England, and with all that cloud around, temperatures in many towns and cities won't drop out of the double figures to start Wednesday morning. Now, with more in the way of cloud around on Wednesday, it's going to take a little bit more time for any of that to burn back towards the east. So a slightly cloudier day for Wales, southwest England, but there will still be bright spells here. And that really sets the theme for the rest of the week, with an east-west split continuing. But we will see temperatures still reaching the low 20s.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me. So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage. Here on GB News, we will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Deebs & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners on TV, radio and online. This is GB News. Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation tonight. Could we be heading for a summer of discontent? Can it be true that the government wants to take us down nightmare lane as it comes under fire over the plans for the tried, tested and failed price control system? Did we learn nothing from Brexit? The British people provided the largest electoral mandate in history, a firm statement against ceding sovereignty to international institutions. Why then could we be granting, in a shady new treaty, the WHO powers which should be determined by Parliament? An election win for Sir Flip-Flop-a-Lot could see even less investment from the UK, as it was reported over the weekend that a major North Sea drilling project could be abandoned over fears of a Labour government. And a whistleblower from the civil service has been awarded £100,000 of taxpayers' money from the Department for Work and Pensions after sounding the alarm over PC political activism. She joins me in the studio shortly. And perhaps the defining story of the week, which you know more about than I do, the Holly and Philip debacle. I do not understand why this is such an interesting story, but everyone's talking about it, even me at Sunday lunch. So who better to have with me to explain why this matters than the great Professor Daniel Wootton? State of the Nation starts now. We'll also be joined by a particularly painstaking panel today, the cantankerous historian Dr. David Starkey and the former Director of Operations to Sir Tony Blair, John McTernan. As ever, I want to hear from you. It's the most important part of the programme. Email me, mailmog@gbnews.com. Now you've had your canapes, it's time for something a bit heartier with Bethany Elsey.
Jacob, thank you. GB News understands ITV is in crisis talks amid the ongoing scandal surrounding Philip Schofield's affair with a younger male colleague. The programme's main sponsor, Arnold Clark, announced it won't renew its contract, potentially costing the broadcaster tens of millions of pounds. Philip Schofield has denied claims there was a toxic culture on This Morning. The show's former resident doctor, Ranj Singh, says he raised concerns about bullying and discrimination 2 years ago and then felt pushed out for whistleblowing. But in a statement, Schofield accused a handful of people with a grudge against him or the show of making accusations. Well, GB News presenter and former This Morning host Eamon Holmes hit back, branding Schofield's post delusional and calling him a liar. Well, you can watch GB News' exclusive interview with Eamon Holmes on Dan Wootton tonight from 9 p.m. Concerns have been raised over the Metropolitan Police's plans to stop attending emergency mental health calls from September. Commissioner Sir Mark Rowley says the move would give officers more time to focus on tackling crime, but that they will still respond if there was an immediate threat to life. Former Inspector of Constabulary Zoe Billingham warned the change could be dangerous by leading to a vacuum in care. 7 men have been remanded in custody after appearing in court, charged with the attempted murder of a senior police officer in County Tyrone. Detective Chief Inspector John Caldwell was shot several times at a sports centre in Omagh back in February. 2 of the men are also charged with being members of the IRA and 3 with the preparation of terrorist acts. Russia has launched rare daytime airstrikes on Ukraine's capital, the 16th air attack on Kyiv this month. School children were forced to take cover and 1 person has been taken to hospital, but no major damage has been reported. Ukraine's military says 11 missiles were intercepted, but emergency services had to clear the debris from roads. Today's barrage follows 2 nights of heavy drone strikes, with Ukraine indicating it will launch a counter-offensive imminently. And the Canadian city of Halifax has declared a state of emergency as wildfires continue to wreak havoc across the region. Dashcam footage shows a car speeding through flames and smoke, narrowly avoiding a collision with another vehicle. The fires have caused evacuations and power outages, and several schools have been forced to shut. You're up to date on TV, online, DAB+ radio and on TuneIn. This is GB News. Now it's back to Jacob.
Some beardless youth in Downing Street is allegedly working on plans for supermarket price controls on essential items such as bread and milk. This is a useless idea. Whilst these measures would apparently be a voluntary opt-in scheme, mandatory controls would be the inevitable next step. That would be the only point of a voluntary scheme. This is how it starts. We tried this in the 1970s and it didn't control inflation. In fact, it stored up inflation and it leads to shortages. Implementing price controls both increases demand because the product's price isn't inflating against people's incomes and other costs, but it decreases supply because companies aren't getting the market price and therefore they won't make the good or sell the good at a loss. And the public is therefore left with shortages. There are only 2 ways of controlling the supply of goods. One is by price and the other is by queue. So if you freeze the price, you increase the queue. It's really quite simple. Supply and demand. This policy would be one that would be dismissed by anyone who had just read the Ladybird book of economics. Simply look at the example of energy. In 2019, under political pressure and legislative pressure, Ofgem began using energy price caps. But when Putin invaded Ukraine and the cost of energy soared, the price cap didn't increase in harmony with the markets. And so, lo and behold, the smaller energy companies went out of business because there was a vast disparity between what energy companies were paying for energy and what they were able to charge their consumers. As a result, the whole policy ended up favouring the larger companies and encouraged oligopolies. It seems the policy only ever works in favour of major corporations and is uncompetitive. Just a few weeks ago, I interviewed a businessman from the West Midlands who runs his own independent petrol station. He pays the same price as the giants for his petrol, like Tesco, but charged the public £1 less per gallon of diesel. As a result, he was flooded with customers. The free market is the solution to profiteering, if there is any within the supermarkets, not socialist price control. And a Conservative government should know that, should know better, and the teenage scribbler should scribble on some other subject. But of course, I want to know what you think. mailmog@gbnews.com. And I'm now joined by my panel, the eminent historian who promises not to be cantankerous today. He's going to be very cheerful, David Starkey, and the former Director of Operations to Tony Blair, John McTernan. John, Tony Blair was never enough of a socialist to think that price controls were a good idea, was he?
No, this is Corbynism. It's extraordinary. I always used to argue against the Corbynites who said they'd won the argument, but it sounds like somebody in Number 10 was been listening to them, that price controls, and you're right, they're saying it'll be voluntary, but voluntary becomes mandatory and mandatory becomes shortages. This is going back to the 1970s in the worst possible way.
And it didn't work in the 1970s, so why didn't people learn?
Because people never learn from history. This is. It's not simply in this that we seem to be having a complete retread of the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s. Political memories are extraordinarily short.
Absolutely.
And we're constantly repeating mistakes. Indeed, I think we're sort of inventing new mistakes. But you left out the most obvious example. It's the Soviet Union. This isn't simply socialist. This is Moscow, isn't it? It's Moscow style. It is Moscow-style economics, and of course, as you said, there'll be Moscow-style. Were it to be imposed, there'll be Moscow-style queues. There'll be fights in the street over a loaf of bread. I mean, and certainly bearing in mind the inflation of the currency, there'll soon be suitcases. I'm mocking, but this is.
But it's true, and then people get round it, so that you won't be able to buy a cheap loaf of bread, which we covered. You'll buy a more expensive loaf of bread.
Which won't have a price on it, a price cap on it.
Brioche, perhaps, if you remember Marie Antoinette.
I think it shows you a weakness at the heart of government, that they think up this idea, that somebody thinks it's a good enough idea to tell the papers, and it's not been killed. It should have been squashed as soon as it was put out there. It's such a ludicrous idea.
Yes, and so unconservative. I mean, this is...
I know.
This is the whole problem of having a fundamentally unconservative government.
It's not a conservative government.
At all. And it's a government that actually doesn't know what I think is truly frightening. It is a government which simply does not know what it is. It lurches from option to option without really thinking about it. I mean, for a Conservative to say straight off, a collapsing market is a price worth paying for reducing inflation.
To be fair to them, President Nixon brought in price controls in the 70s, so you could argue that it was that there has been Conservatives who have adopted
and Ted Heath brought them in as well. But in the 1970s, they hadn't been tried and failed.
Well, they had been tried and failed.
They had been tried in the Soviet Union.
They'd been tried during the war when they'd gone hand in hand with rationing, and you'd had both price control and rationing, and of course a black market. But by the 1980s, it was absolutely clear that price controls didn't work. I actually remember, as an 11 or 12-year-old, my father explaining to me why price controls could not work. Because as a 12-year-old, it seemed quite clever. The government should just set the prices and then you'd have no inflation. It didn't take him too many paragraphs to explain why this was idiotic. And that's what really astonishes me, that this idea is just so stupid. It's not that it's a political idea I'm philosophically opposed to, it's just idiotic.
But isn't it, again, sorry, your point about teenage scribbler, this is the kind of thing which is an apparently easy headline winner.
It's definitely about a headline, isn't it?
It's
about
a headline
on the day.
Again, it's...
not the following
dare one
day,
say it's also, many of the media, the kind of gotcha, what is the price of a pint of milk in Tesco? And it's this kind of thing. Dare one say it also, it's Good Morning Britain politics. It's the Prime Minister sitting on a sofa.
I do long for a politician who goes, I've got no idea, I just always use my card.
Yes, I know. It's exactly the honest response that most of us would I haven't the faintest idea what
I won the card.
But it is... What I think we are laughing at it because it is laughable and it deserves mockery. But on the other hand, as John has just said, it points to a disastrous weakness in government, that there seems to be nobody in charge, there is nobody thinking, and above all, there is no serious discipline of policy.
Well, goodness knows what Treasury thinks about this, because I thought the one thing that was safe about this government was Treasury orthodoxy. Treasury orthodoxy is going to run, but apparently nothing's ever run past Treasury. This idea would have been...
But that can't be right. The Treasury is so powerful that nothing emerges from down strike.
Is it as powerful as PR? You see, one of the things... I mean, this is the problem, isn't it? I mean, you've been in the heart of government. I was chatting, I had lunch over the last week with somebody who'd been in the heart of John Major's government, and repeatedly what you were hearing, it is actually the press office, that it often acts without control, it acts quickly, it comes up with apparently slick, simple solutions. So this is really government by the worst sort of rhetoric.
Well, it's the thing that we always say, which is in policy, there's always an idea that is simple, obvious and wrong.
Which this is in the category of. But to David's point, it does show a lack of direction.
A lack of grip, and I think that's one of the things, is direction and grip.
And is it... I mean, last week you had the Chancellor saying we might have a recession and that's better than having inflation, which was clearly not a good thing to say.
No.
And then you get a response saying, well, actually, to curb inflation will control prices. It becomes a reaction to the last statement that was made.
Yeah, it's running after a headline, but not thinking that the headline has consequences. There's a day after the headline, a second day, a third day, a fourth day.
Well, we need to have a serious conversation about what the Bank of England's got wrong, why we got in the position in the first place, how we reform our institutions so that we don't have this monetary expansion again.
And why our inflation is more persistent than Americans. You know, America's...
Well, the Federal Reserve moved faster and in bigger steps.
But also there's another fundamental point. Surely the principal driver is fuel prices. And the reason is, of course, net marginal pricing of electricity in Britain. Electricity is double the price that it is in most of continental Europe. Can we explain what net marginal pricing means?
Yes, do.
What it means is that the price of every unit of electricity is determined by the most expensive method of generating it at any one time. This makes renewables completely insignificant. At the moment, the most expensive bit of gas, or whatever it is, that you use to generate electricity determines the whole market pricing. It is demented.
You'll be glad to know, whilst I was briefly Energy Secretary, I tried to stop it. But I think there is unanimity on this panel.
Terrifying.
That price fixing is a dreadful idea. Price and income policies should have gone out with the Ark and should remain with Noah. Anyway, remember, we want to hear your thoughts. mailmog@gbnews.com. Coming up, we mustn't be fooled again. Could the government be on the brink of handing over sovereignty to the World Health Organization? Who, if another pandemic were to arise? And don't forget, a civil service whistleblower will be joining me after having exposed some breaches of political impartiality and being rewarded with a £100,000 settlement by the Department of Work and Pensions.
It's the scandal that's rocked British television. Philip Schofield, one of Britain's biggest stars, brought down over lies, deceit and betrayal. Tonight, I sit down with Eamon Holmes as the former This Morning host reveals the truth about the man he shared the famous sofa with.
I think Philip is absolutely right about toxicity, but my friend, the toxicity is not with me, Dan Wooten, or anyone else. The toxicity is with you.
As Schofield hits back, Eamon tells me what really happened inside ITV. Schofield, the real story, exclusively on Dan Wooten Tonight from 9 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
First and foremost, I'm a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me. So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Deebs & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners on TV, radio and online. This is GB News. Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Michael wants to know, where can I get hold of the Ladybird Book of Economics? I'm afraid not in Downing Street. Alan says, simple solution. If you don't buy a product, it comes down the next week and is replaced with something else. Shoppers can control prices. And David says a voluntary price cap is an oxymoron. And Richard, dear Jacob, you're self-expected. We don't have a Conservative government. It fails on both counts. Keep on being Jacob Rees-Mogg. Well, I'll do my best, as I will say throughout the programme. Concerns have been raised in the last few days over the mysterious and rather shady World Health Organization's pandemic treaty. The Telegraph reported ministers are worried that the treaty could grant the WHO the power to enforce restrictions such as lockdowns and vaccine passports upon all signatories. Now, the WHO already has legally binding rules known as international health regulations, which were adopted in 2005 after the SARS outbreak, such as, for example, immediately advising the WHO on health emergencies. But the new accord seeks to extend these powers, and it's clear members of government are concerned by the propensity for overreach. But I can firmly say that I am thoroughly opposed to such an idea. The Brexit mandate was more than just rejection of the European Union. It was rejection of unaccountable, unelected international institutions overreaching into our democratic sovereignty. Well, who better to have with me now than the General Secretary of the Free Speech Union, Toby Young. Toby, I've been reading through the draft treaty, and one of the things is a free speech issue, that they want to control the information that people will get about pandemics to stop what they call disinformation, but could be perfectly legitimate debate.
Yes, that's one of the most alarming things, I think, about these proposed changes to the international health regulations and this new pandemic treaty. So there are these two threats looming simultaneously. Under the new powers that would be granted to the WHO by the amendment to the international health regulations, which only needs to be ratified by 50% of countries in the World Health Assembly, one of their new powers would be to insist, to actually force member states to suppress misinformation and disinformation about health emergencies.
But one of the things we've discovered is that a lot of the information we were getting from the government was not as unimpeachable as you might say. It was at least discussable, as on the use of masks and things like that. And there's now a lot of information saying they weren't as beneficial as we were being told. So you would have thought, learning from what happened in the last 3 years, free speech is very important to get the right answers, to knock down bad arguments.
Absolutely. And, you know, when you're trying to understand something as complicated and fast-moving as a new pandemic, it's important to let different voices be heard. But what the WHO did was to initially make a declaration which was inevitably provisional and then punish anyone who tried to dissent from it. So YouTube, for instance, were asked by the WHO to suppress anyone who contradicted the WHO's guidance. And as you said, they initially said people should not wear masks, that won't make a difference. And then the WHO guidance changed and said, no, you've got to wear masks. It was as though they were telling YouTube to enforce one dictum and then changing their minds 24 hours later and telling YouTube to enforce another. Are we going to grant them that power over our national governments?
Because people in good faith didn't actually know at the beginning of the pandemic and information developed. One of the other things seems to me to be sinister is Article 15(1)(e), which requires that you should ensure solidarity with and prevent stigmatisation of countries that report public health emergencies. Now, that sounds to me as if you're not allowed to say the pandemic started in Wuhan from a laboratory, which there now seems to be very good evidence was the case. And, of course, the WHO was very against people saying that at the beginning of the pandemic.
Well, one of the worrying things, I think, about granting the WHO these draconian new powers is just how hugger-mugger it is with the Chinese Communist Party. We saw that when a WHO official back in 2020 pretended he couldn't hear when he was being introduced to a Taiwanese representative because he didn't want to risk recognising Taiwan and antagonising their masters in the Chinese Communist Party. But one of the really alarming things about this new treaty, Jacob, is that the Director General of the WHO will be able to grant himself all these powers. At the moment, they're just guidance, they're non-binding. But under the proposed change, they'd become binding on the member states, binding on our government. He can grant himself those powers if he declares a public emergency. And there doesn't need to be any evidence of a public emergency. It could just be, in his view, a potential public emergency. We know he's trigger happy about making these declarations because he declared monkeypox a public emergency against the advice of the committee he had set up to advise him on public emergencies. And that turned out to be a complete damp squib.
OK, so there are questions about giving the WHO powers. Are there any bits that you would welcome? For example, it makes it clear that countries can't impose export bans on vaccines and things like that. And that obviously became an issue between the EU and the UK during the last pandemic. Isn't that the sort of thing where you would want to have an international agreement that was enforceable in international law?
Well, under these powers that the WHO wants to grant itself, not only would it say to sovereign states, you have to export, you can't hog these vaccines for your own people, even if you've spent their money on developing them. You have to share the IP, potentially with commercial rivals in other countries. They just be, and there's a lot of vested interests in the WHO. I mean, it's not a democratically elected organisation. They, for the most part, are the paid servants of various rich member states and corporate interests. So I don't trust them to kind of make completely disinterested interventions when it comes to things like the fair distribution of vaccines.
But the IP argument is a nuanced one, isn't it? That if you're developing vaccines, you obviously want the IP to be available as widely as possible. On the other hand, people won't develop IP if they're not going to make a return from it. And isn't that the sort of thing where international agreement and some impartial body may be a good place to be deciding these difficult issues?
Well, I just don't trust them to make the right calls on that in the kind of international public interest, as it were. And let's not forget, Jacob, you're you're pulling out some of the kind of you're putting the most charitable spin on this. The other powers, in addition to being able to force our governments to suppress any dissent from the prevailing WHO dogma, in addition, they'd be able to force our governments to detain people, to force them to be tested, to inoculate them, vaccinate them, if necessary, compulsorily, yes. Close schools. I mean, it's extraordinary, the powers that the WHO wants to grant itself, and it has the backing of the World Bank and the IMF. People say, well, it doesn't have an international police force. How could it enforce these diktats, even if 50% of countries embrace them? Well, the IMF and the World Bank are on board. They could threaten countries like Britain with financial penalties if we don't do the bidding of the Director General.
The IMF, as we've discussed previously, is one of the stupidest multinational organisations that knows nothing about economic forecasting, certainly not about the UK. But the good news is, the reassurance is that none of this can become law because of our due list system in the UK without being passed through Parliament. And is Parliament a sufficient safeguard?
Well, some people, Andrew Bridgen, for instance, are calling for a referendum on this because it does involve the giving up of a lot of our sovereign powers. I mean, I think there is the safeguard that a new pandemic treaty has to be ratified by each of the member states that are then bound by it. But I don't think that applies to the amended international health regulation. So if 50% of the countries in the World Health Assembly endorse the amendments to the international health regulations, then I think they would be binding on us even if our Parliament hasn't ratified them.
I don't think that works like that because the domestic effect of international treaties requires parliamentary action. But that is a constitutional discussion for another day. Thank you very much, Toby. After the intermission, the brusquely incisive panel will be back to discuss Sir Flip-Flop-a-Lot. And don't forget, the civil servant who blew the PC whistle is here after being awarded £100,000.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better.
Crop failures, famine, war, suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
We are putting the cart before the horse. As Charles I said at the scaffold, he was the true defender of liberty.
Yeah, I've completely derailed the conversation.
Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Welcome back. I remain Jacob Rees-Mogg, and you've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Richard says, WHO, who are these clowns? We can't give them more powers. John, this treaty is all about continuing globalisation. It's a total betrayal of taking back our sovereignty after Brexit and an abdication of responsibility. Sue says our governments are meant to represent the people. I do not want the government to sign away our sovereignty to who. And Judith says, Jacob, surely the people of Britain should vote for or against it. It should not be left to the government. When I was Business Secretary and Energy Secretary, very briefly, I did my best to speed up the licensing process for North Sea oil and gas. We also lifted the moratorium on fracking, only for that decision to be reversed by the current government. But let's not dwell on that. The point is, these policies aim to do things that would help the British people. We've already talked about supply and demand economics this evening. With more supply of gas and oil, we could help drive down the exorbitant costs for consumers. Domestic supply is also greener. Even the green zealots of the Climate Change Committee admitted that domestic gas emits between 2 and 64 grams of carbon dioxide less than imported gas. Well, back in January of this year, Sir Flip-Flop was flummering his way around the alpine village of Davos at its annual business conference, where he pledged that a Labour government would bring an end to investment in the North Sea if Labour were to win the next election, by refusing to issue any more licences. And it's now been reported over the weekend that a drilling project worth up to £24 billion is now in doubt over concerns of a future Labour government. So still with me to discuss this is my brilliant panel, the historian Dr. David Starkey and the former Director of Operations of Tony Blair, Sir Tony Blair, John McTernan. John, however green you are, if it's greener to get your gas domestically than to import it, and we're going to be using gas until 2050, isn't it sensible to use your own resources?
No, we have to put an end to drilling for oil and gas in the North Sea. It is time to move to decarbonise our economy. It's right to send the signal that the Labour government would not issue any new licences. North Sea oil and gas is in decline anyway. It's what is it now? The production is about a third of what it was at its peak, and it's falling. It's time.
So we should just buy it from Russia instead?
No, we don't need to.
We're going to need it. I mean, there's no question we're going to need it.
We need to wean ourselves rapidly off it, and that it means we need that network of pipes for carbon capture and storage. We need to use the existing pipes for hydrogen.
Forgive me. Why is it that we seem to be the only country trying to do this? I've noticed that Germany, for example, is now reopening lignite mines, which are the most polluting form, because it actually believes in industry. One of the principal reasons for the collapse of industry.
One of the dirtiest countries in Europe, yeah, I agree.
Indeed, but sorry.
But gas is pretty clean compared to lignite.
Our gas is astonishingly clean compared with German lignite, and it's almost certainly greener in its general effects than American fracking or China. Now, it's all very well to be idealistic. It's all very well to nail your green colours to the mast. Will you, Sir Keir, and will you be honest and tell people that they will be poorer? Will they tell them that the whole...
David, let John answer the question. Are you willing to say people will be cold and poor under this policy?
They won't be cold and poor because we're going to
Magic.
No, because we're going to massively invest in insulating homes, existing homes, retrofitting them, cutting bills permanently. That's the best way.
You know the evidence...
Not to get different source of energy, is to stop.
But you know the evidence on insulation is it doesn't lead to a less use of energy after 3 years. There's been a study that shows that in the first year it has an effect, in the second year a small effect. In the third year, people are more concerned about the
I'm sorry, I'm interested in the little teensy-weensy question of industry. One of the principal reasons for the collapse of industry in Britain is that we have grossly excessive fuel costs. This applies to steel, it is applying across the board. Now, Labour, once upon a time, before it nailed its colours to green masks and to identity politics, believed in industry. Now, the notion that you can have a green industry simply seems to me to be a myth. You are simply selling an emperor's new green clothes. And I really do think, you were talking about honesty. We were talking about honesty and truthfulness in politics before. You are, frankly, Starmer is frankly, telling lies. And but say, why is no other country doing this?
Every country is transitioning to a decarbonised economy. If we get there before other people, we'll have a huge industrial advantage.
What's been the biggest reduction in carbon emissions from the United States? It's been fracking. That has lowered their carbon emissions because they've been using their domestic resources.
It's a shift from one form of fossil fuel to another. In the end, we've got to stop being hooked on the heroin of fossil fuels.
But that's taking decades. That's not happening in a few years.
We don't have decades. We've got 5 years between 2025 and 2030.
It will never happen by 2030.
The crucial 5 years is coming.
It's just not going to happen at that speed.
We have to put climate crisis at the centre.
Why? Bearing in mind... No, but this is purely mythical. We produce 1% of global emissions. India and China are industrialising using the crudest and most brutal methods for very good reason. Do we simply, and I repeat the question, do you wish to kill what remains of British industry? Because that is the honest truth.
No, but it won't do that. It won't kill. Switching to green energy, green hydrogen, renewable energies won't...
Hydrogen?
But we're not going to get... I'm in favour of green hydrogen,
reliable fuel.
But we're not getting to green hydrogen in 5 years. There is no way we can do that. The best we can hope for is blue hydrogen with carbon capture and storage, which needs our own gas, because that is much less polluting than bringing it in from abroad.
In any case, greens, because we've got no means of battery storage, green energy requires carbon fuel for all the moments when the wind isn't blowing. And unfortunately...
It requires nuclear.
And how quickly can we build adequate numbers of nuclear?
We have a large nuclear fleet at the moment. It's shrinking, and it's a terrible thing. It's being stopped by the SNP in Scotland, and it's been terrible.
It's a tiny proportion of our overall energy.
It takes a long time to bring any new nuclear on stream, as we know. There is some coming, but it's not enough.
And it's slow. It's profoundly slow doing it. There's a terrible mismatch between these wonderful ambitions we've got to go green by so-and-so and the fact that the technologies, all of them, are very slow.
It's an industrial strategy.
Dear me, how often have I heard the words industrial strategy more or less simultaneously with price controls? They belong in the 1970s. You're living in another 70s myth that we can control economies, that mere fiat...
Controlling economies, we can support innovation, and we can...
So it's retrograde.
But we can support innovation, but we've got to recognise the time scale is not that fast.
True,
and therefore, in the meantime...
This tiny little field that you've been talking about, it makes a marginal contribution to this. The point is that we have to...
All pricing is set at the margin.
If you're in government, you have to drive hard at the one thing you want to do. Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves, Andy Rayner, Ed Miliband are committed to decarbonising the British
economy. That wonderful figure, Ed Miliband, that figure...
Without working out the cost of the means. That everybody's talking about decarbonisation, but the means of getting there is very expensive.
Well, we have to have a North Star. That is our North Star. Stopping issuing licences. I don't think it'll actually affect this field because it's licensed already. But stopping issuing new licences for oil and gas is the right thing to do for a government committed to decarbonising.
Do you think we'll have another flip-flop on this because it's going to make people cold and poor, and nobody goes into election saying vote for me to be cold and poor? Not even Keir Starmer.
Nobody goes in going, do you know what, I fancy a bit of West of Shetland? I mean, North Sea oil and North Sea gas are going. They're not gone, but they're going. We're not going to take every bit of fossil fuel out of the North Sea, be capped off at some point. The big issue is, can we switch to the energies of the future?
Well, That was a very good discussion between my panel. We'll wait and see if there is a flip-flop after the break. It's the civil service exposed. We'll be hearing from someone who revealed the true colours of the burgeoning woke agenda within the bureaucratic beast. Oh, and don't forget, we'll be hearing from Professor Wootton about the Holly and Philip scandal, which, although it's unclear to me why, has seemingly rocked the nation.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed. So I guess they've always been quite woke. That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat.
Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I continue to identify as Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your male Moggs. Jonathan, why does the UK always have to try to lead the way in the Green Revolution? This always costs the UK taxpayers more money. If we have to buy gas until 2050, then use our own stocks and keep jobs here to produce it. And Angie, Sir Flip-Flop-a-Lot must be debunked. Every day he seems to come out with a new policy that will grab the attention of a section of society. Most of us will realise his policies are empty air. Probably a lot of carbon dioxide in his empty air, and cannot be implemented, but it won't stop people voting for them. For quite some time on this programme, we have covered scandals and controversies regarding the breaches of civil service political impartiality, the Sue Gray affair and so on. We don't just cover things like civil service inclusive language guides for their whimsical attributes. The matter goes right to the heart of our Constitution. Without a politically impartial civil service, there is no hope of a functioning government executing the agenda for which it was elected on a manifesto. Well, perhaps one of the most interesting stories to have come out of the phenomenon of political correctness in the civil service emerged over the weekend. Anna Thomas was employed as a work coach by the Department for Work and Pensions when she became concerned by some of the initiatives being put into place. Ms Thomas took to the appropriate channels to sound the alarms over a job seeker event that excluded white men, resources that told employees to assume that they're racist or how to be, quote, race confident, unquote, or even being directed to the work of controversial critical race theory purveyors. After 3 years with great support from the Free Speech Union, whose director Toby Young was here just a moment ago, the Department of Work and Pensions has shelled out to Miss Thomas £100,000 in a settlement. And she joins me now. Anna, first of all, thank you for coming on, and thank you for sticking up for proper civil service impartiality. You must have had to have shown quite a lot of backbone against some pretty bad treatment within the DWP.
Yeah, I'd say so, absolutely. It's just been, you know, I found a lot of it was, you know, some people trying maybe to do the right thing but misguided, other people maybe a little bit more malicious, and it's just ended up with me losing my job.
And you were being asked to do things, as I understand it, for the Metropolitan Police. You were asked to run a scheme that would not allow white men to apply to join the police. You must have been appalled when that came through, as that is in itself surely racist.
Well, absolutely. It deliberately excluded it with no real reason. We wasn't given a reason as to why that was. And when I raised it with my team, I had an answer that it was about representation. I wasn't even sure whether that was legal or not. I thought that was a bit of a grey area. And the Department for Work and Pensions really has no business in ideological pursuits. So I raised the alarm.
And what happened when you raised the alarm?
It wasn't met very kindly. I was accused of being discriminatory by raising the issue.
So by saying that there was discrimination against white men, you were deemed to be discriminatory?
Yeah.
So who were you discriminating against?
I don't know.
No, this is very puzzling. And then you had to go to lectures on critical race theory, which is a theory that's been broadly debunked anyway. What did your co-workers think when they were going to these? Did they just go along with it, or were they also concerned but not bold enough to make a formal complaint?
So on the intranet, it had the anti-race hub, which in itself is very political, and it had a lot of resources, literature to read, including Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, and we were to educate ourselves on the issues of race. And when I noticed that it was all very one-sided to critical race theory, I did bring up that was a problem and a breach of the code.
And again, what did they say when you said this doesn't meet the terms of the code?
The more higher-ups, the SEOs and upwards that I dealt with were not in favour of what I was saying. They were insinuating that I was guilty of something, but they alluded to what I was.
And you were basically being told that you were all racist automatically and you had to overcome that as the sort of starting point for the discussion.
That's right. There was a part on this anti-race hub that said, treat racism like COVID-19 and assume you have it. And I thought, oh, OK, right, that's really, really a bold statement.
But that's quite offensive, isn't it, to say to you and to other people working in the DWP with no evidence that you are just racist because you are a white lady?
Yeah, it's just ideological. It had no business being there.
And then the Black Lives Matter issue came up, and we know that that is a hard left organisation that wants to defund the police. It's a deeply political organisation. And what were they doing? What business did they have being influential within the DWP?
I'm not sure why it was there. I think a lot of, more powerful senior civil servants maybe have done a moral panic and been like, oh, this came out, because it was only 3 months after George Floyd had died. And I think they had just adopted this quick, let's put it through, we want to seem virtuous maybe. I can only assume that's what they were doing.
And did you find that the people you were working with in DWP were, privately when you chatted to them, understanding of what you were saying, but actually it's the structure of the civil service that has sort of embedded political correctness and therefore was very resistant to any challenge?
Yeah, there was some people who, because you could openly comment as like a public forum, that you could comment, and some people were saying, we're not sure of this, and then they were kind of encouraged to pipe down, I guess.
Yes.
And I was a bit like, no, this is too ideological, this is breaking our code.
And then when you reported it, you met a sort of wall of obstructionism from essentially woke hierarchy within the DWP.
Yeah, so there was the commenters that, like, so it's parallel. Like, so I was vindicated that I was right, that this was political, and in the handwritten note in the disclosure document, it said Anna isn't wrong, and that Peter Schofield, the permanent secretary, should not have adopted the critical race theory. But on the other side, people took offence to the things that I had said, that it was political, and that's why I was fired, because I apparently caused offence.
And you were then fired for causing offence, and then, with the support of the Free Speech Union, took a case, and, well, you got an award of £100,000, so you must have had a pretty strong case.
Very strong.
And you've been a public servant. You were devoting your life to helping people in our society, less fortunate, who needed help. It must have been really very upsetting for you to be treated as if you were doing something wrong when you were trying to make the civil service follow its own code.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I did enjoy my job. It could be challenging, you know, and I dealt with people from all walks of life as a work coach. And, you know, I have a duty to uphold the code. Whatever politics I may have, that's at the door. I don't bring it in. And to treat people as individuals. And, you know, we got a lot of successful results. And to be told, you know, this provision's available, we need to promote it.
Well, I think you've done a double public service by revealing this, so thank you for what you've done for the country. We asked the Department of Work and Pensions whether they accept or deny the allegations made by Anna Thomas. But all we received was this rather discursive response. The DWP spokesman said, "We can confirm an employment tribunal claim brought against the department was settled by agreement of all parties without the need for further legal proceedings." Seems to me if they've coughed up £100,000 of your money, that the allegations are pretty likely to be true. Anyway, now we've got Professor Daniel Wootton, who is going to explain to me all about the Philip Schofield story. He's going to have Eamon Holmes on later, and we'll know everything about it. But just for some of my viewers, because even we've been discussing it at home over Sunday lunch, what on earth is going on? Why is it so exciting? Why is it dominating family conversation?
Well, and the news agenda, and I will tell you, Jacob, it is not to do with Philip Schofield's private life. It actually isn't even to do with his sex life. What this is about is ITV, the biggest commercial broadcaster in the UK, and whether they covered up quite a serious situation involving the most famous TV presenter in the country and a young staff member on the This Morning show who he met, Jacob, as a young teenager.
And you were the first to reveal this. You told ITV about it some years ago, and they basically seem to have ignored it, and we now know didn't even speak to the young man concerned. Is that right?
That's right. When I was executive editor of The Sun in November 2019, I went to the Group Corporate Affairs Director, who reports directly to Carolyn McCall, the woke chief executive of ITV. Of course, she was formerly of The Guardian, with this information. And he came back and claimed that it was malicious gossip. Well, we now know that it was anything but. Philip Schofield has done a full mea culpa about the relationship. And in tonight's interview, Jacob, you're going to see just how widely it was known about at ITV. Eamon Holmes revealing that this young boy or teenager would be ferried from Philip Schofield's house to the ITV studios on a regular basis. So there are real question marks about what ITV knew and when, and why they decided to cover up a clear abuse of power rather than actually protect this young man.
Because that's what it's about. It's about an abuse of power and then covering up for the star and allowing the young man to be so much chaff beneath his wheels.
Of course. And look, we do have to remember that Philip Schofield was seemingly happily married at the time to a woman, so it is a shocking story. It's got all of those ingredients, but at its heart is whether ITV, which is an organisation which claims to be a paragon of virtue, you know, if you say anything that isn't woke, Jacob, you're pretty much immediately yanked off air at ITV, whether they are actually big hypocrites, because they like to preach about what's right, But actually, when it comes to their own house, it feels very toxic.
And that's the key. It's the woke agenda in ITV that covers up. That's going to be such an interesting discussion you're having with Eamon. I must confess, even I have found this story interesting, having been very sniffy about it to begin with. But that's coming up later on, after the weather. I'll be back on the morrow at 8 o'clock. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. This has been State of the Nation, and it's bound to be sunny in Somerset.
Good evening, my name's Rachel Ayres and welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast brought to you by the Met Office. So this Bank Holiday Monday has been pretty settled and that's not going to change as we go through tonight or the next couple of days, with this area of high pressure still remaining centred to the northwest of the UK as we go into the end of May. But it does mean that we have got these brisk northeasterly winds pushing cloud into eastern areas, and that is